Good afternoon, everybody. I am Terence Orslan. I'll be the MC for this session today. We have our esteemed member of the CIM MES to make the presentation today about the critical minerals. The title is Canada Has What the World Needs, Transforming Critical Mineral Supply Chains. And our speaker again is David Anonychuk. He actually just switched firms. He's with the Senior VP, Advisory and Growth, North America at DRA Global, with over 30 years of global experience in mining, metallurgy, and strategy. He works across the full mining value chain. A former senior executive at SGS, Glencore and Xstrata, is recognized for his leadership in critical minerals and their role in battery, defense, and energy supply chains. He's generated ideas about White House and all this stuff. Sorry. And make presentations to NATO and the White House. He regularly speaks at senior industry, policy, and media forums, including BNN Bloomberg. David serves as a co-chair of the Critical Mineral Council for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's a member of the International Energy Agency, IEA, Critical Mineral Expert Advisory Group, and sits on the advisory panels to Natural Resources Canada. His abstract essentially is critical minerals and in details, and for about 1 hour, as much as 1 hour, he's going to be able to entertain us with respect to all the insights. Next slide, please. Going back to CIM. CIM, Management and Economic Society of CIM, short MES, is the leading not-for-profit technical association of professionals in the Canadian minerals, metals, materials, and energy industries. CIM has 10 other technical societies and more than 25 local branches across Canada. CIM's vision is to be the trusted authority and collective source for advancing mineral industry knowledge, guidelines, and best practices. The mission of CIM, we do this every time just to make sure that everybody gets this message, how much volunteer work goes into this CIM affairs and programs. CIM mission is cultivate knowledge, best practices, and innovation to support our members, improve awareness of the minerals, the metals industry, and society, and evolve the sector responsibly. The institute was incorporated in 1898 by an Act of Parliament of Canada as the Canadian Mining Institute. In 1920, it became the Canadian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, and in 1990, it became Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy, and Petroleum. Next slide, please. CIM MES actively, our society group, actively works towards furthering education in mineral economics. It uses the funds it raises to support various educational initiatives and programs in mineral economics in Canadian universities. In addition to members involved in the economics and management of mining at CIM MES, has expanded to encompass members involved in all aspects of the management of companies active in the mining and petroleum sectors. CIM MES sponsors various events across Canada throughout the year that provide industry professionals with the opportunity to network and share experiences, insights, and ideas on topics relating to the economics, management, and financial aspects of the business. Next slide, please. Our sponsor is silver sponsor is IM Gold. It's been associated with us for a couple of years. We appreciate their input and their generosity. Next slide, please. Now is David will come to the stage.
Actually, before David comes, just one.
Yes, the questions, the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that there's a Q&A slot in the on the Zoom call. Please write your questions over there, and I'll be screening them. And at the end, we will come to the Q&A within half an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour, whenever David finishes his presentation.
So
thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so in between now and when David finishes his presentation, do input your messages, your questions or comments in the chat box in the Zoom menu, and they will be read out to David accordingly.
Thank you. Let's go.
David,
Great.
without further
Thanks,
ado.
guys. All right, as soon as I find the button here to share screen, full screen. I just wanted to first start, let's see, just make sure you guys tell me you can see it before I start talking. All good, Terry?
Yes, it's all good.
Okay, good. First of all, I want to thank all the volunteers at CIM MES. We couldn't do all the events, all the behind the scenes, the social media, like I said, all the planning, CIM Connect, CIM, CPS, Capital Project Symposium, the discussion group without our important volunteers. So a big thank you. Before I start the presentation, I did want to mention the Capital Project Symposium, which is November 8th to 10th in Toronto, downtown Toronto. We had a very successful one last year. More than 250 people attended. Major mining companies, projects, consultancies, service companies working across the entire supply chain. The event theme this year is From Risk to Resilience, Delivering Successful Capital Projects in a Volatile World. And over the 2 days, there will be 4 sessions. So geopolitics and market outlook, finance and investment, execution excellence, and cross-sector learning. We already have, right now, the team is working on a lot of those, high value presenters. We'll be sharing it very shortly. We're talking, senior leadership at mining companies, senior people at consultancies, and so forth, including some government people. So stay tuned for more announcements. You can, the website is capitalprojects.cam.org here. So please check it out. Please sign up.
And
so
one last thing is
Hi, Carlos.
Seats are limited, right? So register sooner rather than later. We expect hopefully to be a full house.
And we have expanded the organizing committee. So thank you to the wider organizing committee this year. We do have new members. And Carlos DaCosta and I are the co-chairs. So you have the two of us right in front of you. Again, thank you everyone for all the work behind the scenes. We'll continue to share more. All right, with that, let's start. First of all, these are new colors for me. So it's been 2.5 weeks now at DRA. So it's great to be part of the team. The talk today is Canada has what the world wants, transforming critical mineral supply chains. You may have heard this before, but first let me just a quick mention on DRA. If you don't know us, leading global multidisciplinary engineering, project and delivery operation management group. We are 40 years in the business, 4,000 people across the globe, 8,000 projects. If it's gold, base metals, critical minerals, iron ore, we do it. Jumping right in, did I make up that title? No. If anyone's been paying attention to Canadian government over the last, 12 months plus, the Canadian government has been very strategic by putting that sentence over and over. Canada has what the world wants. September 25 at the UN, Carney speaking. In Davos, the famous Davos speech, where a lot of people, international people, even outside of Canada, was paying attention. The words again, Canada has what the world wants, and reiterated at PDAC, March, in March. And that's Minister Hodgson in the bottom right of the screen, our federal energy and natural resources minister. And you can see behind them on the screen, they put it right on the screen. And that was the day where they awarded a whole bunch of new funds to critical mineral projects for Canadian critical mineral projects. So very consistent, all this messaging. But before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about critical mineral lists. Is this a new concept? And in fact, where did they start? So I went back and said, scouring the internet, how far could I find this? Well, guess what? Conflict. the U.S. government in both First World War and Second World War, they came out with in those early days, like I said, First World War, they compiled their first 42 strategic materials list, and it had a bunch of different names back then, War Industries Board and so forth. But the key metals back then, based on the technology of the day, their big need was chromium, manganese, tin, and nickel, obviously for alloying purposes. And then in the late 1920s, they actually classified some of the terms that we still use today. What is strategic, so essential and mostly imported, like chromium, manganese, and tin for the US, and critical, so things that are important to their supply chain, but more accessible domestically, like copper and lead for the US. And guess what? The Quebec government today says MCS, minéraux critiques et stratégiques. So they still use those words today. And then the other one that we hear about is stockpiling. There's a lot of announcements on, NATO stockpiling, Canadian government, Americans also. We did see this at the beginning of World War II. There was an act passed. So the actual act, the Strategic and Critical Materials Stockpiling Act, is actually on the screen. That's an excerpt from 1939. And back then, they allocated 100 million, again, to the same similar metals, chromium, manganese, tin, tungsten, and nickel. The value today is somewhere around 2.4 billion, which is kind of rings true because we're in the billions now when the U.S. government's talking about their interest in stockpiling. But it was conflict that really brought these critical mineral lists, in play. But we've seen an evolution of these critical mineral lists. This is the one that I think we see the most in the United States, the USGS Critical Minerals List, 2018, they only had 35. Well, guess what? With inflation, and now we see 60 today, but the US has the DOE Critical Materials List, there's a defense list, so there's actually many. The one that got a lot of attention early was EU. Europe was ahead of the game. They started their critical raw materials list back in 2011. They started with 14. This is one of the nicer maps. This layout was from 2020, where they were aligning the commodities with the different end use sectors in this. I'll call it vibrant spaghetti diagram. But they had inflation too, because 2023 their list went from 14 to 34, and in 2024 they got serious because they enacted the Critical Raw Materials Act to help enter this in force and set certain objectives for what they're going to import, what they have to do domestically, how much they have to recycle. And of course, Canada, we jumped in the game because we initiated our Canadian Critical Mineral Strategy in 2022. We had two lists. Ours was in 2022, they had the first list was 31. It expanded to 24 in 2024 to 34. So we added 3 new ones, which I'm trying to remember if it was phosphate, high purity iron, and I forget the last one. And the question is, what's the value of these lists? If we look back, since this critical mineral list was launched, or the strategy was launched in 2022, Canada has seen a 10% production increase in 9 of the critical minerals. It's the one that I've circled below. And of course, if we look at a lot of across the Canada's G7 partners, obviously Canada is blessed from border to border to border, is what we always hear them say, that there are minerals everywhere across all provinces and territories in Canada. There really is no area that everywhere is blessed with these natural resources, whether they are now in production or will be developed in the future to advance these supply chains. So now let's sort of dive into some of the drivers and what are the geopolitics of critical minerals and rare earths. And of course, the primary issue and the main driver here is the geopolitical tensions and export controls, especially around China. It's the restriction on rare earths and critical minerals that have really got a lot of the US and EU concerned, and the other G7 partners, because of the fears of supply chain disruptions. Every 3 or 4 months, we see the U.S. administration hopping on the plane, although there's a lot of trade issues that are being debated and other, conflicts. Minerals and rare earths are always in the background, and we're always hearing announcements pop up about restrictions in China and U.S. administration trying to negotiate and slow those things down. But that's been a major one. And as a result, we've seen strategic alliances form, like the G7, the G20 get closer together, NATO and its members, because there's been this supply chain realignment. And it's really driven by government policy actively shaping these supply chains. I mentioned the EU Critical Raw Materials Act. So in 2024, their metrics were, we're going to for 2030 is they're going to do 10% domestic extraction, 40% processing, as well as 15% recycling within the EU. 2025 was a very consequential year. Many announcements. Just looking at a few from US, we had in March 2025, they had their domestic executive order on domestic mining. And then they followed that very closely with an executive order in April on advancing deep sea mining to bring that to their supply chains. And then we saw a whole bunch of announcements, US administration with a whole host of countries like Australia, Japan, Indonesia, and others, where they were having these, critical mineral alliances. But also Canada played its part, leading the G7, bringing together many, partnerships together. And then we start talking about stockpiling, which we'll touch in a moment. And then all the signaling from the policy side, of course, the investor side said, hey, well, if we're going to be doing a lot of investment across these supply chains domestically and across these partnerships, then the funds got in the game. And one of the bigger ones is JP Morgan. They launched their $1.5 trillion fund. I think the front end of that fund is, $10 billion focused on US supply chain. We saw major mining companies get in the act. So Agnico Eagle is Canada's largest mining company. They are obviously primarily a gold company, but guess what? They changed their stars. They said, we are launching the Avenir Minerals Unit, and they've been investing in several projects, early stage projects, and they've stated publicly, that is our goal. Although they've invested, I think, in Canada and outside, but their main goal is to advance projects, early stage projects in Canada, given obviously their expertise in bringing projects on, and we do applaud that. Other projects have benefited too from the market, like Lynas in Australia and Malaysia. Was able to raise new funds as one of the few producers outside of China for rare earths. Orion is another well-known name. $2 billion fund backed by US and UAE. So we are seeing the impact of policy moving towards the investment side. So the question is, well, where did all this view come? Where are these policymakers taking their attention? Where are they getting this information from? Well, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, plays a large role. They are composed of, I'm trying to remember if it's 48 different nations contributing to the IEA. Obviously, their main focus is energy, but they've pivoted over the last few years into critical minerals. I'm fortunate that I'm on their committee. I'm a peer reviewer to their global critical minerals outlook reports, as well as there was a recent rare earth report that came out in April. But they are very important to the G7 because they are the analyst for the G7, and really what they say has a big impact on the direct policy. And if we look at some of those highlights, the IEA, if we pull out kind of what was the main message for their global critical mineral report back last May, these supply chains concentration have worsened going back from 2020 to 2024. We can see in this chart, if red is China and we look at the who is the major refiner across these main critical minerals: copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and rare earths. You can see there's a lot of red as you go left to right. But some of these are, China is refining some 90% plus to some of these commodities. And despite the fact that G7 was talking about this in the past, they did very, very little to change that. And I think that's what changed in 2025, where Canada was the lead for the G7. They took this seriously. They took action in the messaging, because the idea is if we don't change, we're not going to be in control of our supply chain. And just to go even further, if we take the sort of top 20 individual critical minerals and we look at only the lead refiner, China is the lead refiner of 19 of 20 of these critical minerals. And the only other one that is the lead is Indonesia, who is the lead producer for nickel, which is no surprise because they're very closely connected to China as well. And when the IEA said, let's look forward 10 years, they said, well, the concentration will not decline very much. The top producer is averaging somewhere around 86%. In the next 10 years forward, it will go back to a concentration of about 82%. And so we're really only unwinding where we were around 2020. And in their report, the IEA stressed to the G7, we really need to diversify supply chains, increase investment to meet that future demand, to avoid the risk of these supply disruptions. Just a word, I did want to share a little bit on rare earths. It is one that comes up a lot. The rare earth market itself is looking to grow about 8.5% compound annual growth, by 2030. It really is a mix. It's sort of split down the middle between these permanent magnets and non-magnetic end use. And often we hear about defense all the time in rare earths, but defense is not the main driver. It's a high risk, vulnerable supply chain that has a lot of consequences, if from a defense point of view, but most of these rare earths are found in things related to consumer products, e-mobility like electric vehicles. Your iPhone has rare earth magnets. That's the haptic, that's the buzz when your phone vibrates. Your AirPods in your ear have those same rare earth magnets in it. It's because they're powerful, they're strong, and they have very unique properties, which makes them efficient. And just one last comment from the IEA, and this is from their recent rare earth report. They said, what would be the economic impact if we saw production risk based on the export controls that China was talking about in 2025? And they said, if everything that they restricted, where would it impact? Well, automotive was the one that it would be the most consequential, but across all the supply chains, the economic risk for that lack of access to production could be somewhere between 6.5 trillion. These reports are, you can easily Google, but I would go read them. This one is quite fresh, issued in April 2026. So going back to what I said, 2025 was a very consequential year for Canada as the G7 lead. There was a lot of planning with industry and the Canadian government behind the scenes, talking to major mining companies, talking to the project owners, talking to the consultancies and service side. I was one of those as we gave feedback. What did we need in Canada as they rolled out a lot of that planning, working with the G7. And in the end, last year there was normally there's a communique for the G7. Well, they could not agree on the final communique because of I'll say there's a lot of trade things going on at the time last May and June. So, however, the G7 partners did agree on a critical mineral action plan. So all countries agreed. This is the actual document that the Canadian government issued on behalf of the G7. And in the end, the main focus was, hey, they did validate what the IEA said. We need to diversify. responsible, and produce responsible supply chains. We need to pay attention to these market-based standards, which is, hey, ESG, pricing, stockpiling, but we need, how are we going to do this? Mobilize capital. We need partners that are going to work together. But how are we going to be competitive? We also need to make sure we're promoting innovation. This paragraph that I've circled is very consequential because it really does address China. And I'm going to just read it out here. We have shared national and economic security interests, which depends on access to resilient critical mineral supply chains governed by market principles. We recognize that non-market policies and practice, i.e. China, in the sector threaten our ability to acquire many critical minerals, including rare earth elements needed for magnets that are vital to our industrial production. The point here is they put it in writing. They meant what they said. This was, serious time, because in the past at any G7 meeting, you were lucky if you got 2 sentences in your communique. They had a couple pages only focused on saying, we, the G7, will change and we will work together. So what did that mean for Canada? And if anyone remembers the budget in November at the end of the year, there was a whole bunch of announcements. We also had the Canada initiated what they call the G7 Critical Mineral Production Alliance. By the time that the PDAC rolled around in March of this year, there was some 18 billion in announcements related to Canadian projects with 56 different partners and alliances across both the G7, Australia, Norway, and Ukraine. I would say, really expanding, to a lot of the G7, G20 countries. But the other thing to point out, and maybe not everyone's aware of this, but in that November budget, critical minerals fell under the Defense Production Act for Canada. That was already the case in the United States, but this now applied to Canada, and that allowed them to unlock new tools so they could invest in the supply chain. And one of them that was announced was the 2 billion Critical Minerals Sovereign Fund. You may have heard that is meant to advance projects that are in an advanced stage and going into a construction stage. But also it gave the Canadian government the ability, if they chose, to invest as an equity owner, basically buy, shares or equity into companies directly. They could provide loan guarantees in terms of, financing. But the other new one was they had the ability to enter in offtakes. Now the Canadian government could be a buyer, whether it's for their domestic purposes or part of their future NATO commitments. And the first ones that were announced back last fall, Rio Tinto Scandium, there was an offtake announced with the Canadian government in graphite. Nouveau Monde also had an offtake. And if anyone saw in the last couple of weeks, Nouveau Monde had a groundbreaking ceremony. Carney was there, and many others to celebrate that, advancing that project. And then the other one was, as I mentioned, the ability for these offtakes to enter to stockpiling, but also price support if the Canadian government, chooses to do so. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what does this mean? What's actually happening around this NATO and stockpiling? Well, back in December 2024, NATO, they had their own critical mineral list. They had their own 12 critical raw materials related, obviously, to that defense supply chain, which is no surprise. Fighter planes, tanks, missiles, the different, whether it's destroyers and so forth. There's no end of, critical minerals, whether it's for alloys or communication. We need batteries, for example, in the field for communication, as obviously very important. And if anyone was paying attention to the media in the last, 18 months, there was a big push for the individual NATO countries to say, hey, you're not meeting your fair share of spending. And so Canada at the time was below that 2% of their GDP. So last year they definitely increased their NATO spending, and they got up. They did telegraph, we're going to get up to 2%. We're not done. Their future commitment is to meet 5% of Canada's GDP by 2035. So although, like I said, last year was somewhere around a commitment of NATO to 60 billion, that's going to expand to 150, somewhere between 150 and 160 billion by that time. And guess what? Critical minerals and other raw materials could be considered under that calculation. And that's why also during the G7 last year, I believe a week after the G7, they all went to Brussels and they all got together and said 12 countries. So Canada was one of the signatories amongst, like I said, 12 other NATO countries to say we are going to create a new project. And then NATO, they call them high visibility projects when countries are working together. And this one was focused on storage and management of stockpiles for defense purposes. And again, including raw materials. And the idea here is NATO said, we just don't want to be caught short. Given that conflict is increasing, we need to be prepared. But they put it in writing as an MOU at that time during the G7. I was fortunate enough to present in an industrial panel last fall on behalf of the Canadian government to talk about Canada in terms of its the opportunity that it has, its deep ability to advance projects across many different critical minerals, and obviously because we're a mining powerhouse, compared to I'll say a lot of NATO countries in this list, that they are in mining, but Canada just is has so much potential to contribute and is taking a lead. The other thing that I can share, as I mentioned, that when NATO countries come together to work on common projects, they call these high visibility projects. And at the time in the last fall, there was 29 of them. Obviously, a lot of them are more like technology focused and defense focused. But this was the first time they had something new, and it's the one circle called critical raw materials. This is all public. All these, you can find all these names in terms of the different projects, but this was the newest one. It is complicated. What does it mean to stockpile? It's not easy. Not everything has a shelf life. Some things can sit, if it's a metal, it can sit longer, but critical minerals often are in the form of high purity chemicals, and they may not have long shelf life. So there are cost implications to storage. It is not easy as we think, but there is a lot of debate happening across industry. A lot of the think tanks, with the IEA put out a report in I think it was 2 or 3 months ago on stockpiling as they garnered opinions across the supply chain. So this is something that those NATO members are talking about. The goal for this critical raw material program, high visibility program, is they would like to get into an agreement with the countries by the second half of 2026. That's at least the goal. So expect to see more, but there's a lot of opinions being sought in terms of, is this helping, or is there, what are the risks? But these are super important. Bringing this all together, I was in Ottawa, Canadian Chamber of Commerce. This is the head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Candice Lang, was hosting a fireside chat with Minister Hodgson and the IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol in Ottawa, and I was fortunate to attend. That's me in the middle with my head down. I was taking notes on my phone voraciously for everything they were saying. And the message is really everything that I kind of said today. A lot of the discussion, it was a love fest. Minister Hodgson and the head of the IEA, it was nothing but compliments. The discussion was around how Canada is leading, but it also meant Canada can't do it alone. They want to develop their own domestic supply chain, but they absolutely need those international partners for collaboration, but also to be competitive, because this is about competition and opening new supply chain. Minister Hodgson reiterated the new tools that some of them I already mentioned, but there's the Canadian Infrastructure Fund to help mining projects advance, because sometimes it's the last the kilometers of the highway, or is it the connection to the grid? There's the Canada Growth Fund now that is now that is for that first capital, the new capital that projects need, again, because we're doing nation building. The Critical Mineral Sovereign Fund was announced last fall, and that's to, again, help advance projects that are either advanced or into construction. Recently, we heard about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, also as a way to invest back into Canada, and as well as this major project office to make sure projects are advancing. There is permitting reform. The federal government is talking with the provinces to try to alleviate some of these bottlenecks. So if I look back to, if you go back to 2024, there was a lot of talk. 2025 was a year of action. It was the Canadian government being very pragmatic and businesslike about, we've got to take action. We've got to open the wallet. We want to invest back in Canada, and we're going to do this group hug with our international partners. They did mention that tools are great, but in Canada, back home, we need more public awareness for the importance of both our energy and our mineral supply chains, because there is a limit to what we can expect from the government to do. So we need to bring those other investors in and getting that strong support of the public. And then, one of the last messages was repeated, and I wrote it here 3 times: build the midstream, build the midstream, and build the midstream. And the reason is, it doesn't stop at mining. If we're going to create employment, we're going to create, grow Canada and its GDP, we're going to need more, that midstream processing, not just build, mines where we're going to export things outside. So that's a big part of the discussion. And one of my favorite comments, and this was from Fatih Birol, executive director of the IEA, and he was talking about, let me tell you, what the most important commodity is? It's trust. And he was looking directly at Minister Hodgson. So, that's how the conversation has changed. We've seen actions taken, a lot of announcements, and it's not just Canada, US and EU and others, Asia Pacific. There are a lot of actions happening. The other thing I can say from my seat as industry, there is so much behind the scenes background, and I guarantee, I can tell you that whether it's major mining companies, project owners, service companies, we are all behind the scenes trying to help where we can. We're on the ground giving advice to these policymakers to make sure that all this makes sense and we are adding value, because we want to reduce risk. We're at this. It's a paradox today. We're in a world of, we only talk advance, but in reality, and I'm talking from an engineering company point of view, we need to reduce the execution risk. We need to invest more. And that's a very difficult conversation because the market's not ready for that discussion. But that's why, again, I'm happy, to be here today to share some of those experiences from behind the scene and seeing how all these pieces together, because the industry, it does matter, and we need all those partners, government, academia, and industry. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, sir. First of all, I will say that the presentation will be available on the site in due course. It's being taped, and it will be available, Carlos, I guess, in the next few days, right?
I would imagine a week. But
Yeah.
if you look at the chat box, what I did is I put the link of where you're gonna be able to access not only David's presentation, but past presentations where we're allowed to record the video, the presentation. So it's everything there. So I suggest scroll down. There's lots of good stuff there for you to review at your leisure.
We are organized. We are organized.
Yes, we are. Very.
David, a couple of questions here before I fire a couple of them that I have. But how aligned are federal and provincial policies in practice? Question starts with. And where do jurisdictional conflicts risk slowing Canada's ability to meet G7, IEA, NATO supplies?
That's a big question. I was like, that's good job for consultant.
Carlos, that's from Carlos. I can talk.
But what I can say is there is actual discussion. The provinces are definitely engaging the federal government. So, example, I mentioned permitting reform. One of the goals of the federal government is to reduce the, I'll say, inefficiency from time, meaning if federally or provincially or regionally, there are requirements on permitting, and the main message is let's not do it 3 times, the same, repeating and reviewing. If they can harmonize some of the workflow so that those same stakeholders are being addressed once for the same criteria, let's try to streamline it to reduce that. It's the time wastage, right? From that point of view. So we are seeing those conversations. Not all provinces are equal. Some have bigger budgets, some are way more advanced. I can tell you Quebec has always been ahead from a supply chain point of view, but other provinces are catching up quickly. I'm spending time in British Columbia. They've really changed their tune in the last 12 months. Premier EB in terms of the messaging, adding new, whether it's, critical minerals or mining to their portfolio in terms of the ministers. Even on Ontario, Stephen Lecce, he's out there, super visible. Every time you watch a sporting event, there's always an Ontario, well, I'm Toronto-based, there's always Ontario government commercial on mining and supply chain. It is happening. We need to see the results, though.
On the other side of the equation, David, in China, we have about 4 major universities with PhDs, graduate students pouring out over 50,000 that work for schools.
Hey, Terry, we're having
capacity. I'm sorry?
We're having difficulty hearing you.
What's our educational capacity for graduating students with the R&D and knowledge? All sectors, all the chain of the critical metals, from exploration all the way to the fabrication.
So, well, I missed. Yeah. What was the question? Is what's the front end of the question?
Our academic capacity to be able to come up with the goodies that the graduate students and all.
Yeah, well, workforce is a big question. If someone says, what do we need? I always rank these 3. I always say financing. Without capital, there's no projects. We need the permitting to, de-bottleneck and unblock projects. But number 3 is workforce. Without a workforce, and that could be the trades, where most mining projects are in remote areas. They're not in big centers. We need those, the trades. I've worked in Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec myself. But then all the technical people that are supporting projects in many different ways, we need the next generation. And talking to students when they're exiting university is too late. We've got to get to them earlier. There's a lot of provincial programs in Quebec, for example, trying to bring technical people into Quebec. There's subsidies that they were offering to try to bring technical people. And the other problem is visas. I faced it in my prior employer. We would hire someone from another country, fantastic person, and guess what? The visa approval process takes too long, and that candidate says, guys, I can't wait. Sorry, I took another job. I've gone elsewhere. So workforce will be a big issue. And it's the same thing. Working at an engineering company, you have to think about liability. At some point, we always say partner with your engineering companies and other technical partners early, because once they are full, and there is a risk that you'll have to say no at some future date if we're going to bring all these projects on. So partner early with the best.
Andy, I think a lot of people say that metallurgy is the bigger issue than the mining and exploration. The fabrication, the R&D, the flow sheets. Where are we on that?
I mean, there's so many areas. It's hard to say what's the most important in a supply chain. There's many different complexities to build it. We need that the entire supply chain working. Like I said, it's hard to focus on just one, and we need skills across all of them. Think of the new grads, environmental science, all those new consultants coming on. That it's the face of mining is changing itself in terms of the complexity. and the different skills that we need. Yes, we need the core ones, but we also need new ones. So honestly, we need all people across the entire supply chain.
So another question follows up what we're discussing now. It says, where does Canada face its biggest bottleneck building end-to-end critical mineral supply chains? Extraction, processing, midstream refining, or downstream manufacturing?
Capital, number one, as I said in my other comments.
Yeah.
Without capital, we need investors. The Canadian government will do what it can, but there's a limit to what it can do. And its goal should be there to be early to develop the supply chain, but we do need the investors to come in to support. And my other comments were, look, we're really good at mining, but in order to increase our GDP, we need to do more in Canada in that midstream processing. But you need partners to do that. You need, you need everyone. Like I said, we need our neighbors to the south on the end use. We need our east and west. We need Asia Pacific, and we need the EU. We need everyone to create those strong partnerships. We have to change our supply chains, and that's part of. So the end users have to take the risk to change their buying habits as a way to change those purchases to keep it within those partnerships.
How much transparency are in the prices of the metals versus base?
They're not all the same. The major commodities, copper, zinc, aluminum, nickel, those are international markets. They're liquid. But other commodities, let's talk about rare earths, neodymium, one of the main magnet metals that we find. If 95% of the refining for rare earths is in China and the downstream manufacturing is also 95%, there is no price discovery outside of China. This is the whole point of why the IEA has said, guys, alert, like if you want to develop a supply chain outside, you have to come together. You need from the mining to the midstream processing to the refining to the manufacturing in the G7, the G20 countries have to work together to change so that a true price, not a suppressed price, but a true price can be discovered. And you need a cost curve. You need to develop a cost curve for some of these very niche commodities outside of China so that they could be priced appropriately.
Market per se, price, buyer and the seller negotiate the price.
Sorry, I didn't hear you, Terry. Can you repeat it?
Can the prices be negotiated between the consumer?
Yeah, I mean they certainly can, because some of the material that's being sold may have very specific specifications and may not be, it may be opaque in terms of the pricing. It may not be public because these things are not traded on international markets. Like I said, unlike copper and zinc, nickel, aluminum, where those are major mature markets. You can look up what is an LME price, for example. These other ones you can't. You have to have that through direct buyer and seller purchases with very different specifications, because not everyone has the same specification.
Terry, we're having difficulty hearing you.
Let's see. Got to turn off the video. The question is, given the global...
we're still having difficulty hearing.
Yeah, you cut out, Terry.
Okay. Carlos, can you see the question?
Which one is it?
Given the global competition from the US...
Okay, let me just...
I can read it. I heard the beginning of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that question too.
All right.
That's okay. Sorry. Okay, now, another question. Given the global competition from the US, EU, Australia, China, what is Canada's actual comparative advantage, i.e., geology, ESG standards, capital projects, geopolitical reliability, etc., and how durable is that advantage?
I mean, all those things affect how Canada's competitive or not, right? That's so when the government speaks, they always bring up the being competitive. And that's why when we look to advancing these projects, some of they're new. These are not mature supply chains. That's why when we look to some of the major mining companies, you look at again what Agnico did. You know, Canada's largest mining company, they are a gold producer. And they said, we are going to change the nature of who we are, and we are going to open up and help advance critical mineral projects. Did they have to do that? No, gold is killing it. But they said as a company, we have that execution excellence. We know how to bring projects on, and they want to play their part. And there's many other voices out there. All the majors are doing their part in terms of their voice, and I think that's an important part of what Canada has is that experience bringing projects, to production, because Canada has deep roots. That's where we leverage that technical knowledge. But if you go to other countries, let's say look at the United States. Sometimes litigation gets in the way of advancing projects. We don't have that same issue, for example, that we would see in Canada. And it's the sheer number of projects in the world based on exploration. I forget if it's Australia, between Australia and Canada, they're number 1 and 2 in exploration in the world. So there's a whole host of reasons. And then you add the technical capabilities. Think of all the major mining companies, all the projects, all the technical people. That's what stands out for Canada.
Question. Are First Nations fully engaged in the process at the table with the provinces?
Let me just read it because we had difficulties hearing from you. Are First Nations fully engaged in this process at the table with the provinces?
Well, it is part of when we look at community on anything that's NI 43-101 in Canada. When we look at social responsibility and community, that is part of what must happen. But when it comes to First Nations, that's about trust.
Yeah,
that's and there is different experience. And I remember my Nemaska days, in terms of the First Nations, they were very advanced. They were very experienced in terms of the negotiations, how to engage, for example, Nemaska Lithium with the different companies, construction companies, engaging the community, and others are new. Other First Nations, there's new projects in different areas, so there's different challenges depending on how familiar you are. But that's all about establishing trust with those local communities. But it is part of a technical report. It's something that every company must do as part of the process.
Yeah. A question from CH. Basically says, a few years ago, the push was for minerals and metals to support the green transition. And now it seems that certain countries are more focused on defense and security. Can you comment on the demand shift between the baskets of commodities for the two drivers and how this impacts Canada? Electrification and renewable energy, and the defense REEs and critical minerals.
So sometimes the policy is led by the politicians and who's in power at the time, and what is the need for the countries at the time. So go back, let's say 3-4 years ago, everything was EVs and batteries at the time. That was the main focus. And it shifted because of the increase of conflict we're seeing in the world, now defense has come to the forefront. But guess what? The reason defense is there is, think of the risk to national and economic security. If you're, a major G7, G20 nation, and you don't have access to protect your country, it's a massive risk. You could be stopping your industry, not just in defense, but other aspects. So I think that's where although some of these commodities are much more niche, they present a super high risk, and that's what shifted in the narrative. And by the way, EV and renewable sector is certainly not dead. In an era of high oil and gas prices, we are seeing a return actually to people saying, "Hey, that's not sustainable. I need to relook at going back to new renewables and EVs. I can tell you the electric vehicle stats are, if you go back to like I said, increased conflict, we're seeing higher EV sales in March and April already as a result of what's happening globally. These things will ebb and flow. I think going forward, they're even more closely locked together because there's no substitute with the demand coming. If you don't have the supply, it is a major problem for governments.
Rob asks, how do the stockpiles get priced into global commodity markets if the volume is opaque? What risk does the market carry for stockpiles unwinding, as happened in late 1990s with the DLA stockpiles flooding the market?
It is a big risk, and when I had the opportunity to present to NATO in an industrial group, we tried to bring out those early comments of saying on one side, we understand the need to stockpile and we understand why you want to be prepared for your supply chain in the future, given the risk of escalation of conflict. But on the other side, you better understand the cost risks because as you stockpile, there are costs. Things aren't liquid. Every time you move something, it costs you money. There are a lot of hidden costs associated with stockpiling. So it is not the end all be all, and it must be extremely carefully studied because you don't want, I'll say, call it leakages to find out, because who's on the hook? It is the taxpayers at the end, where they are, government stockpiles. So I think there is a lot more dialogue behind the scenes. The IEA did put out a report addressing those risks that I just mentioned. So if you do a quick IEA stockpiling, there is a recent report on it.
Okay, there's one question and one comment to go, and then we'll call it quits with the questions and the comments. Okay, so the question is from Scott, and he says, for the mainstream area, is there a fear of if you build it, they won't come?
Again, going back to think about the politicians. So we have to be careful between who's in power at a given time and what is I'll say, the mantra of the day. All the industry, people that when we're behind the scenes, we say, look, we need a strategy for the medium and the long term, regardless of who's in power at any given time, whether it's, like in a province, in a state, or even in a country. We want the strategy to outlast who's in power at the time, because things change.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is, the more that we talk about the actual needs of supply chain, I can tell you, for example, why did Neo Performance build a magnet plant in Estonia? And it's because its two end users said, I will change my purchases. I will give you an offtake, and I will not buy for China for, I don't know if it was a portion of their supply chain, but because of that commitment, Neo Performance built a magnet plant in Estonia. And that magnet was the one, by the way, that magnet from that plant was delivered to the G7, it was handed, I believe, from the EU ambassador to Carney at the opening of the G7, something like that. But the point being, we need a commitment across supply chain to make real business sense. These should not just be pipe dreams. We need this to become real economic reality.
So Scott, but based on Scott's question, CH, I don't know what CH stands for, but CH says, or if you build it, China will flood the market and make your operation unsustainable without subsidy. I wonder about this as well, particularly which minerals and metals would be most susceptible to this.
I mean, if we do nothing will change. That's part of it. And we do live in a world where, look at the US, extremely entrepreneurial. If something doesn't work, they may do a take two or a take three, but I guarantee the US will come through, for example, from a supply chain point of view, because that investment engine does affect things. But if we don't have price discovery, and if we don't develop supply chains, we'll never know. That's part of that test. And people in the end have to be willing to pay the price for the true price outside of China. Are we willing to change is going to determine our behavior.
Okay, so I'll let Terry take over, okay, just to close off. And then what I'll do is, if before we leave, so don't leave just until I tell you about our next event on June 10th. So Terry, feel free to closing remarks, and then give me 30 seconds of your time, and I'll tell you about our event on June 10th, and then you can enjoy the rest of the day.
David, thank you. I know how much effort you put into this presentation for everybody. The charts, the speech, the presentation, you've been working on this for a while, and you've been covering this sector for a long time. So I hope everybody can hear me.
We're hearing you this time.
David, thanks again. Great working with you with the CIM MES, and great presentation, and good luck with the old job at the new place. And the topic is excellent. Thanks very much again on behalf of everybody.
Okay,
appreciate it, Terry.
So let me just give me 2 seconds, and then we'll call it quits. Okay. So if you go on to our MES website, which is cimmes.org, okay, and you go on the right-hand side where it says upcoming events, click on the June 10th event, you will see this, okay? So our next speaker is going to be Stuart Bergman, Chief Economist and Vice President of Export Development Canada, and he's going to be presenting on basically the current economic state of Canada as it looks as of today. So do join us, do register for this event. Like always, our discussion group events are free, so we encourage you to join us. We encourage you to share these events with your friends, colleagues, and others, okay? We can technically hold about 500 people. Right. So in other words, we've got room for everybody. Okay. So do join us, and we'll see you again on June 10th. We want to thank our sponsor, Iron Gold. We also want to thank you, our audience. We also want to thank, last but not least, David. Okay, for great presentation. One last thing before we go. I know we said 30 seconds, but I'm Portuguese. 30 seconds means 2 minutes. So anyhow, but if you like what we do with MES, okay, we cannot do what we do at MES or even CIM without the generosity of our volunteers. So if you've got the time and you've got the energy and you got the interest, right, do reach out to us. Okay, we are always looking for some good quality volunteers. It's not much. It's about maybe a few hours a month, okay? But you know, your time, your efforts will be greatly beneficial for everybody in the Canadian community and beyond. Because these events, these discussion group events, we have an audience from throughout Canada. We've got audience also internationally. So we're expanding audience base. So have a lovely day, and we'll see you again on June 10th.
Great. Thanks, Carlos. Thanks,
Thank
Terry.
you very much. Take care.
Thanks, audience.